The ambulance blazed down the narrow lanes, lights flashing and sirens screaming as it cut through the evening traffic. Inside, Sophie was lying on the gurney, her face twisted in pain as another contraction hit her like a wave. She gripped her husband Leo's hand, her knuckles white. "It's okay, Sophie," Leo said, trying to keep his voice steady. He brushed damp hair from her forehead. "Just a little longer. We're almost there." She let out a shaky breath, managing a half-smile through the pain. "Tell that to this kid," she whispered, clutching his hand tighter. The EMT, Lewis, glanced back from his position near the gurney, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension filling the small space. "Hang in there, Mrs. H. Hayes. We're less than 5 minutes away from the county general." 5 minutes feels like forever right now, Sophie said, her voice tight as another contraction clenched her abdomen. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Louis gave her a reassuring nod. "You're doing great. I've seen a lot of mothers in labor and you're handling it like a pro. Just breathe through it." Sophie tried, sucking in a deep breath and squeezing Leo's hand. Leo watched her, helpless, feeling every groan and gasp cut into him. He looked to Louis, silently asking if they'd make it in time. Louis caught his look and nodded confidently, radiating a calm that was contagious. "County General is ready for you," Louis added. "They've got a room and a team prepped. We just need to get you there." Leo tried to focus on Louis's words instead of the tension in his own chest. He leaned down to Sophie. "Hear that? We're in good hands. Just a few more minutes, honey." Another contraction hit, and Sophie bit back a cry, her hand clamping down on his. Leo could feel his heart pounding as he held her, hating the sense of helplessness gnawing at him. Just then the ambulance jerked slightly as it slowed. Louis furrowed his brow, looking up as the siren faded. "What's happening?" Leo asked, anxiety flaring in his voice. "Why are we slowing down?" "I'm not sure," Louis replied, worry flickering across his face. He craned his neck to look out the front windshield. The flashing lights reflected off the glass, illuminating the sudden ominous halt in their journey. As the ambulance rolled to a full stop, Louis leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Through the windshield, he could see the rotating lights of a police cruiser parked directly in their path, blocking the lane. The driver's side door of the police car opened, and a uniformed officer stepped out, his face obscured by shadows. "What in the world?" Louis muttered, glancing back at Leo and Sophie. She was pale and sweating, clearly in the throes of another contraction. Louis didn't want to waste any time, but he knew he had to handle this carefully. "Stay calm," he said to Leo, who was staring at the police car in disbelief. "I'll see what he wants. Maybe there's been some kind of mistake." Louis lowered the passenger window as the officer approached, hands on his hips, an unmistakable air of authority in his stance. "Is there a problem, officer?" Louis asked, trying to keep his voice even. The cop, Officer Charles, leaned down, his face barely visible under the brim of his hat. "What's your rush?" he demanded. Louis blinked. "Taken aback, sir. We're an ambulance with a patient in labor. We need to get to the county general immediately." Charles narrowed his eyes, giving a slow nod as if he were considering Louis's words. "I saw you running a light back there," he said coldly. "That's a violation, ambulance or not." Louis's jaw tightened. "Sir, with all due respect, we're on an emergency call. The hospital's just a few minutes away." "Rules apply to everyone," Charles replied, his tone flat and unyielding. "License and registration for the vehicle." Leo from the back had been listening, his anger flaring as Sophie's breathing grew ragged. He leaned forward, raising his voice. "Are you serious right now? My wife is in labor. She needs a hospital, not a damn traffic stop." Charles shot him a hard look. "Sir, stay out of this. I'm talking to the EMT." Louis tried to keep his composure, but his patience was wearing thin. "Look, officer, I don't know what you think is going on here, but we're wasting precious time." Charles leaned even closer, his gaze cold. "I'm not going to tell you again. License and registration now." Behind them, Sophie's voice wavered. "Leo, please." Leo's fist clenched as he turned back to her, desperation in his eyes. "Hold on, honey. I'll get us out of this." He shot a glare at Charles, but Louis placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling him to stay calm. They had to be smart about this. Louis kept his voice level as he met Officer Charles's cold stare. despite the rising frustration gnawing at him. "Officer, this is an emergency. My patient is in active labor and every minute counts. We don't have time for this." Charles's face twisted in irritation. "I don't think you understand. I saw you blow through a red light. I have to check your paperwork. Protocol." "Sir, we're on code 3, lights, siren, emergency status," Lewis replied, his tone still calm, but growing sharper. "It's completely legal to run a red in this situation. You're putting my patient's life in danger by stopping us here." Charles's eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me about the law. I know the law. And from where I'm standing, you're out of line." Lewis opened his mouth to argue further, but Charles's expression darkened, his patience visibly thinning. Suddenly, the officer grabbed the handle of the ambulance door and yanked it open. Louis took a step back, instinctively raising his hands, palms outward, in a non-threatening gesture. "Hey, no need to get physical," Louis said, forcing himself to stay calm, aware of the frightened woman and her husband just behind him. "I'm just doing my job. We're trying to save a life here." But Charles didn't seem to hear. He stepped up into the ambulance, his frame blocking the exit, his jaw clenched. "You think you can run your mouth and disobey an officer's orders?" Louis kept his hands up. "I'm not disobeying anything. I'm asking you to let us go because this woman needs a hospital now." "Enough!" Charles barked, his eyes blazing. In one swift, violent motion, he swung a fist at Lewis, landing a punch square on his cheek. Louis stumbled back, slamming into the cabinets behind him, pain exploding in his jaw. "Ah, Louis!" Leo shouted from the gurney, half rising in shock. Louis touched his cheek, his head ringing, the taste of blood flooding his mouth. He looked up, anger and disbelief simmering behind his eyes, but he held his ground, knowing any retaliation could escalate things further. Behind him, Sophie whimpered, clutching her stomach as another contraction gripped her. "Sir, please," Louis said through gritted teeth, still attempting to de-escalate. "We don't have time for this. She's in labor. This isn't about you or me. It's about her life." Charles's lip curled in disdain, and he took a menacing step forward. Outside, a few cars slowed as passing drivers noticed the altercation. The siren lights painted red and blue flashes across the growing scene, highlighting the tension between them. Leo couldn't take it anymore. The sight of Lewis staggering from the officer's punch, combined with Sophie's worsening pain, shattered any restraint he had left. He shot up from his seat, nearly tripping over himself as he stumbled toward the back door of the ambulance and swung it open. "Hey!" Leo yelled, fury tightening his voice. "What the hell is wrong with you? My wife is in labor. Are you trying to kill her?" Charles turned to face him, his expression turning cold and unyielding. "Sir, get back inside the vehicle and stay out of this, or I'll arrest you for obstruction." "Obstruction? Are you insane?" Leo's face was red, his fist clenched. "We're in an ambulance. My wife needs a doctor now," Sophie's voice called out from inside, strained and weak. "Leo, please, it hurts." Her plea only added fuel to his anger. He took a step closer to Charles, his gaze unwavering. "Let us go, or so help me." Before Leo could finish, Charles shoved him, sending him stumbling back against the side of the ambulance. Leo caught himself, his balance wavering, as he glared up at the officer, fury blazing in his eyes. Standing down, Charles barked, pointing a finger at Leo, his other hand inching toward his belt, as if he was ready to draw his baton. A few of the passing cars slowed down further, drivers rolling down their windows, eyes widening as they took in the scene. Murmurs could be heard, and a few people began recording on their phones. But Charles didn't seem to care. His gaze was locked onto Leo, a clear warning that he wasn't done yet. Leo's fists clenched tighter. "You don't get it, do you? My wife and baby could die because of you. You're supposed to serve and protect, not beat up people trying to save lives." Charles's face twisted with irritation. He raised his hand and shoved Leo again, harder this time, nearly knocking him off his feet. "I said stand down. Should Officer Charles have stopped the ambulance during an emergency? Let us know in the comments below, and give this video a like if you're eager to find out how this ends." Inside the ambulance, Louis struggled to his feet, his jaw still throbbing from the punch. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Charles and Leo, trying to act as a barrier, "Officer, enough," he said firmly. "We're dealing with a medical emergency here. You're jeopardizing the patient's safety. Step aside." Charles looked at Louis, then back at Leo, visibly frustrated. For a moment, it seemed like he might relent, but then his jaw clenched again, his hand twitching at his belt. The tension thickened, the scene on the verge of further violence, while Sophie's pained moans grew louder from within the ambulance. Red and blue lights flashed on the gathering bystanders, some of whom were now openly filming the escalating confrontation, their phones capturing every heated word and shove. Inside the ambulance, Sophie's breathing was ragged and shallow, her hand gripping the edge of the gurney as she fought through another wave of pain. Her face was pale, panic etched into her features as she listened to the muffled sounds of yelling and scuffling just outside. Every shout sent a spike of fear through her. Jody, the other EMT, kept her voice low and steady, placing a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder. "It's okay, Sophie. Focus on me, okay? We're going to get you through this." Sophie looked up, desperation clear in her eyes. "Jody, what's happening? Why aren't we moving?" Her voice trembled as she tried to suppress another groan of pain. Jody kept her voice calm. "There's just a bit of a delay outside. That's all. Louis and your husband are handling it. Don't worry. They won't let anything happen to you or the baby." Sophie's hand clutched Jody's tightly. "I don't know if I can do this. I need to get to the hospital. Please, can't someone make them move?" Jody squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I know we're doing everything we can, but for now, I need you to stay strong and keep breathing with me. Can you do that?" Outside, the shouting grew louder, and Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, clinging to Jody's voice as her only anchor. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, the ticking clock weighing heavily on both women. Outside, Leo's voice was raw with anger and desperation as he squared up to Officer Charles, who still blocked their path, baton in hand. The crowd of onlookers had grown, phones raised, recording every tense moment. Leo's hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw set in fury. "You think you can just push us around and get away with this?" Leo spat, his eyes blazing. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Charles's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat, sir?" Leo took a step forward, undeterred. "It's a promise. I'll see to it that you lose your badge, your job, everything. And I won't stop until you face every consequence possible." Charles's expression flickered, but he kept his stance firm, though his hand lowered slightly from his belt. "Watch your mouth, or I'll have you arrested for intimidation." He asked Louis, nursing the bruise on his cheek where Charles had punched him. "Step forward," his voice cold and steady. "Arrest him. You're the one obstructing an emergency. We're recording everything too. You're not going to walk away from this officer. You assaulted an EMT on duty, obstructed emergency services, and put 2 lives at risk." The officer's face reddened with anger. "I don't take threats from civilians, especially not from a couple of hotheads like you." "Then do your worst," Leo replied, his voice low and deadly. "But I swear, I'll make sure that you never get away with this. I'll see you dragged into court, and when my father-in-law's office is done with you, you'll be lucky if you can get a job as a security guard at a parking lot." Charles's hand clenched around his baton, but he hesitated. For the first time, he looked unsure, glancing back at the crowd of onlookers, many of whom were filming and murmuring in disbelief. At that moment, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Yeah, let the ambulance go." Other voices joined in, muttering in agreement, calling out in support of Leo and Louis. The crowd's energy shifted, now openly hostile to Charles's actions. Seeing the tide turn, Leo stepped forward again, pointing at Charles. "Last chance, officer. Move out of the way." Charles's face twisted in frustration, his gaze flicking back to the ambulance where Sophie's silhouette was visible in the back window, pale and straining in pain. For a moment, he looked like he might back down, but his pride held firm. "Move back now!" Charles snarled, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "I won't warn you again." Just then, another siren cut through the noise, drawing closer. Leo glanced over his shoulder, seeing more flashing lights approaching. He steeled himself, unsure if this would make the situation better or worse. But unwilling to back down, the crowd turned, watching with anticipation as the backup police vehicles pulled up and parked. 2 police cars came to a stop just behind Charles's cruiser, their lights flashing as they pulled onto the shoulder. The crowd quieted down slightly, watching as 2 new officers stepped out of the cars, each taking in the tense scene with a quick, practiced assessment. The senior officer, tall with gray streaks in his hair and a hardened expression, walked over to Charles with a no-nonsense air. "Officer Charles, what's going on here?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Charles straightened, clearly trying to save face. "Sir, I stopped this ambulance for traffic violations, and these individuals have been obstructing my investigation." The senior officer raised an eyebrow, casting a quick glance toward Leo and Louis, who were both standing beside the ambulance, bruised but resolute. Then he looked at the growing crowd, many of whom were holding up phones, recording everything. Obstructing an ambulance with a patient in labor. The senior officer's tone was incredulous. He glanced at the ambulance, where Sophie's strained face was visible through the window. The tension in his jaw indicated that he understood the gravity of the situation and was not pleased. Leo seized the moment, stepping forward. "Officer, this man has been delaying us for no reason, putting my wife and child's lives in danger. He assaulted the EMT and refused to let us proceed to the hospital. If anything happens to them because of this, I'm going to make sure he pays for it." The senior officer's expression darkened as he turned back to Charles. "Is this true?" Charles opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to stick. He looked around, realizing the full weight of the situation. The cameras pointed at him, the senior officer's sharp gaze, and the crowd murmuring in outrage. The balance of power had shifted. "Stand down, Charles," the senior officer ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We'll handle this from here." Charles's face flushed, but he had no choice. Reluctantly, he took a step back, his shoulders slumping as he surrendered control of the scene. As Charles reluctantly stepped back, the senior officer, Captain Morales, turned his attention fully to the ambulance. His sharp gaze took in the bruises on Louis's face, the strain etched into Leo's features, and the unmistakable tension hanging in the air. He raised his hand, signaling the other officer who had arrived with him. "Officer Daniels, secure the scene," Morales ordered. Daniels nodded and quickly stepped between Charles and the ambulance, creating a barrier. Charles, still flushed with anger, opened his mouth to object, but Morales cut him off with a hard glare. "Charles, we'll talk later," Morales said, his voice low and unyielding. "Right now, I want you away from this ambulance. Go sit in your cruiser. That's an order." Charles's mouth snapped shut, his jaw clenching in frustration. He cast a glare at Leo and Louis, who were watching him with barely restrained anger, and then turned on his heel, marching back to his car. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, murmured approvingly. Phones stayed raised, but now there was a sense of relief rippling through the onlookers. Captain Morales stepped closer to Louis, eyeing the bruise on his cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked. Louis nodded, though he looked shaken. "I'm fine, but my patient isn't. She's in active labor, and every minute counts. We need to get her to the hospital now," Leo added, his voice cracking with relief and urgency. "Please, Captain. She's been waiting too long already. Just let us go." Morales gave a quick nod. "Understood. You'll get to the hospital immediately." He raised his hand and motioned toward the ambulance driver, giving him the all clear. Turning back to Louis and Leo, Morales said firmly, "Well, take care of this. Get her to safety. And thank you both for keeping things as calm as you could." Without further delay, Louis nodded his thanks and moved quickly to the back of the ambulance, preparing Sophie for the final leg of the journey. Leo climbed in after him, taking his wife's hand again as the driver fired up the engine. The sirens blared to life, cutting through the remaining tension. As the ambulance sped away, Captain Morales turned to the gathering crowd, his stern expression conveying authority and command. He scanned the faces of the onlookers, then focused on the officers recording the incident on their phones. "Thank you, folks. We appreciate your cooperation," Morales said, his tone measured. "If anyone has footage of what happened here, I'd like you to share it with us. Your videos could be critical in helping us address this incident." The crowd murmured in agreement, and several people nodded, willing to comply. As the bystanders began to disperse, two of the officers approached Morales, one of them murmuring that the police chief was on his way. Moments later, a dark SUV pulled up, and Police Chief Ray Alvarez stepped out, his eyes immediately assessing the scene. Alvarez was a tall, commanding man in his 50s, with a no-nonsense look that conveyed both authority and integrity. He walked over to Captain Morales, who briefed him quickly on the situation. When Morales finished, Alvarez's expression darkened, and he nodded, turning his gaze to Officer Charles, who was sulking in his cruiser. Alvarez strode over, his posture rigid with anger. "Charles stepped out of the car," he ordered, his voice low but authoritative. Charles hesitated, then slowly climbed out, his face a mix of resentment and fear. He glanced over at the remaining crowd, clearly aware that the chief's intervention was being watched closely. Chief Alvarez didn't waste time. "I've already reviewed the initial reports from Captain Morales. Your actions tonight were reckless, unacceptable, and an embarrassment to this department. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation." Charles's eyes widened, his face going pale. "Sir, I was just—" Alvarez held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. You had no right to stop that ambulance or escalate the situation. If there's any truth to the assault allegations I'm hearing, you can expect disciplinary action. And if the videos confirm it, we'll press charges." His voice left no room for argument. Alvarez then turned back to Morales, speaking loud enough for everyone still lingering to hear. "I apologize on behalf of this department. I'll personally ensure this officer is held accountable. No one should ever have to go through what those people did tonight." The crowd murmured approvingly, and a few people even clapped. Morales nodded in agreement, feeling a slight sense of relief that justice, at least in this moment, was being served. District Attorney Paul Everett was in his office, hunched over a pile of case files. When his phone rang, the ringtone was distinctive, set specifically for his son-in-law Leo, so he would never miss a call. But tonight he almost didn't answer. It was late, and he assumed it was a quick update on Sophie's labor. "Leo," he answered, keeping his voice calm. "Is it time?" "Paul?" Leo's voice came through ragged and panicked, cracking on the other end. "Paul, something horrible happened." Paul straightened immediately, a sense of dread tightening his chest. "What are you talking about? Is Sophie all right?" "Sophie's in the hospital, but there was an officer. He stopped us, stopping the ambulance on the way to the hospital. He punched the EMT, shoved me around, and refused to let us go. We lost almost 20 minutes on the side of the road." Paul's grip on the phone tightened, the anger building like a fire in his chest. An officer stopped the ambulance. His voice dropped, steely with barely contained fury. "Who was he?" "Officer Charles." Leo spat the name like a curse. Some arrogant cop who decided he was more important than an emergency. If it hadn't been for backup arriving and the police chief stepping in, I don't know what he would have done to us. Paul's mind raced, the weight of his role as the district attorney pressing against his personal instincts. Officer Charles won't get away with this, not after putting my daughter and grandchild at risk. He could barely keep his voice steady. "Stay at the hospital. I'm on my way." Leo's voice was thick with urgency. "Sophie's condition is bad. They had to rush her into surgery." Paul didn't respond immediately, swallowing the surge of fear that hit him. "I'll be there right away," he said tightly. Hanging up, he stood, his expression hardened, already formulating his next steps. Paul pushed through the hospital's double doors, scanning the crowded waiting area. His eyes found Leo, who was pacing by the reception desk, visibly disheveled and bruised, his face leoed with tension and exhaustion. Leo looked up, relief flooding his face as he spotted Paul. He moved toward him, meeting his father-in-law's gaze. Paul immediately saw the anguish behind Leo's eyes, and he felt his own fury intensify. "What happened to you?" Paul asked, his tone gentler than before, as he noted the cut on Leo's cheek and the tense set of his shoulders. "This cop was a total jerk," Leo replied bitterly. "He wouldn't listen to a word we said. I tried to tell him and begged him to let us go, and when I said anything, he just got angrier. He was completely out of control." Paul's fists clenched at his sides. "I can't believe this." Leo looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. Even Sophie was begging for help. She could barely breathe, and he just stood there, watching us suffer. A nurse walked over, interrupting their conversation. "Mr. Everett?" She looked between them. "The doctor will be out shortly to update you both. If you'll wait just a moment." Leo's face tightened as he nodded, but he couldn't sit. He kept looking toward the hallway, as if expecting Sophie to appear at any moment. Paul stayed at his side, feeling the weight of his own helplessness gnawing at him. He was a man used to wielding power, yet here he stood, unable to do anything but wait. Minutes later, a doctor in blue scrubs stepped into the waiting area, his face solemn. He looked around, quickly finding Leo and Paul, and approached them with a steady, professional demeanor. Paul and Leo immediately turned toward him, their expressions tight with anticipation. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Everett?" the doctor began, glancing between them. "I'm Dr. Chen. I was overseeing your wife's and daughter's emergency procedures." Leo's throat worked as he struggled to speak. "How are they?" Dr. Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. "The situation was critical. We had to perform an emergency C-section due to severe fetal distress. Your wife also suffered from complications related to the delay in getting her here." Paul's face tightened, anger simmering beneath his composure. He looked down briefly, then back at the doctor. "But they're alive?" "Yes, doctor." Chen confirmed. "They're both stable, but it was very close. Both your wife and the baby are in critical condition, and the next 24 hours will be crucial for their recovery. We're doing everything we can to monitor them closely." Leo's shoulders slumped. The relief mingled with an overwhelming weight of anxiety. He looked at Paul, who was standing rigidly, jaw clenched. "What? What complications?" Paul asked, his tone hard, his gaze fixed on Dr. Chen. Chen hesitated, then continued. "The delay in transport exacerbated both your daughter's and grandchild's conditions. Your daughter's blood pressure spikes due to the stress, which could have led to severe complications. We had to act fast to prevent further risks." Leo covered his face with his hands, exhaling shakily. "This is all because of that cop. He stole time we didn't have." Paul's voice was low, each word carefully controlled. "I understand, doctor. Thank you for doing everything you could." Dr. Chen nodded, giving them a brief sympathetic look before stepping back. Leo looked at Paul, his face twisted with anger and sorrow. "This was preventable, Paul. If it weren't for that officer, they wouldn't be lying in there right now, fighting for their lives." Paul put a hand on his shoulder, his gaze fierce and resolute. "He will answer for it, Leo. I'll make sure he does." Paul sat alone in his dimly lit home office, hands clenched tightly around his phone. He just returned from the hospital, where Sophie and her newborn were still in critical condition. His mind flashed with images of Sophie's pale face, the frantic words of the doctor, and Leo's shaken voice detailing every appalling second of their ordeal. The rage simmered, cold and focused. Without a second thought, he dialed the number for his most trusted private investigator, Jack Thornton, a former detective with a reputation for digging deep and pulling out secrets, no matter how carefully they were buried. "Jack," Paul said as soon as the man answered, "I need you to find every single scrap of dirt on an Officer Charles from the 7th Precinct." Jack didn't hesitate. "What's he done?" Paul's voice was steel. "He stopped an ambulance carrying my daughter in active labor, assaulted the EMT, threatened my son-in-law, and delayed her treatment until her life and my grandchild's life were at risk. I want to know if this is a pattern or if it's a one-off. Either way, I need ammunition." "You'll have it," Jack replied, the weight of Paul's words unmistakable. "I'll start digging tonight. If he has a history, I'll find it." "Good," Paul replied, his tone grim. "Anything you get, I want it on my desk as soon as possible. No shortcuts, no delays." "You'll have everything I can get, Paul," Jack promised. "This officer won't have a shred of privacy by the time I'm done." Paul hung up, staring at his desk, his mind already turning over strategies. Charles wasn't going to get away with endangering his family, not on Paul's watch. 2 days later, Paul received an email notification from Jack. The subject line was simple: Charles Report. Paul opened the attached document, his eyes quickly scanning through the meticulously compiled information. The further he read, the darker his expression became, Charles had a record, a damning one. There were multiple complaints filed against him over the years: excessive force, verbal abuse, intimidation tactics, and even accusations of assault. Each incident had been quietly swept under the rug. Victims had filed reports, but every time the complaints had been either dismissed for lack of evidence or settled internally, leaving no stain on Charles's official record. Paul's jaw tightened as he continued to read. Charles had a history of targeting individuals in vulnerable situations, often bullying them into silence or compliance. It was clear the officer had been protected by some in his department, allowed to continue his behavior without consequence. Paul shook his head, disgusted. He picked up his phone and dialed Jack's number again. "This is more than enough," Paul said, his voice hard. "Send everything to my office. This is going public. I want his history in every court record I can file and every paper that will print it." Jack's voice was equally grim. "The media's going to eat this up, Paul. You're sure about making this much noise?" Paul didn't hesitate. "I'm sure. Charles is a danger to the public. It's time everyone knows who he really is." Later that day, Paul gathered his legal team in his office. They sat around the large conference table, a somber tension filling the air as Paul laid out the situation. "We're moving forward with criminal charges against Officer Charles," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "We have enough evidence to go after him for multiple counts: assault, obstruction of medical services, reckless endangerment, and abuse of power. He not only endangered my family but has a pattern of similar behavior that's gone unchecked for too long." One of the senior attorneys, Linda Cho, leaned forward, her expression resolute. "With the evidence we've compiled, we can push for an indictment. The footage from bystanders, the EMT's testimony, and the complaints we found in his past will paint a clear picture of his unfitness for duty." Paula nodded. "I want to make sure that every single one of his actions that night is examined, and I want his past misconduct to come up in court. He needs to answer everything." Another attorney, Matt Jacobs, spoke up. "We should consider civil charges as well, such as intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly even negligence. This will reinforce our criminal case and ensure maximum accountability." Paul's gaze hardened. "Yes, file both criminal and civil charges. I want him stripped of his badge and made to face every consequence of his actions. And once we're done with him, I want his enablers in the department held accountable too." Linda nodded firmly. "Understood, Paul. We'll prepare to file as soon as possible. This case is going to be high profile, but with the evidence we have, we're ready for it." In a dimly lit room, Officer Charles sat alone, his mind racing. He'd spent years skating through his job with a mix of aggression and arrogance. But this time felt different. The incident with the ambulance hadn't gone as expected. He'd been publicly called out, reprimanded by his captain, and he could feel the pressure mounting. People had been recording. His hands clenched as he thought about the consequences he might face if the footage fell into the wrong hands, or worse, the district attorney's hands. Reaching for his body cam, he carefully navigated through the settings. He knew exactly what he needed to do. In his mind, this wasn't tampering. It was correcting a misunderstanding before it spiraled out of control. All he needed to do was erase the footage of that night. He leaned over his laptop, connecting the camera, and began searching for the file. But as he scrolled through the footage, he felt the chill of unease settle over him. Deleting official footage was no small thing, and he knew it could be easily traced, but he was desperate. If the video circulated, he'd lose everything. Taking a shaky breath, he hovered his mouse over the file, his finger trembling. A knock sounded at his door, making him jump. He quickly unplugged the camera, shoving it into his desk drawer. "Come in," he called, trying to sound calm. It was Officer Daniels, one of the officers who had intervened that night. Daniels looked at Charles with a stony expression. "The chief wants to see you in his office now." Charles's stomach twisted, but he forced a nod. "All right, be right there." By the next morning, the first video surfaced online, a shaky recording taken from a bystander's phone. It showed Officer Charles shoving Leo against the ambulance, his voice cold and dismissive, as he barked at the EMT and husband to stand down. In the background, the desperate pleas of a woman in labor echoed from inside the ambulance. The video spread quickly, moving from a local forum to social media platforms where it exploded. The comment sections were filled with outrage. Words like brutality, abuse of power, and reckless were thrown around as people reacted in shock and horror. Then came the second video, even clearer than the first. This one showed Charles raising his fist to Lewis, the EMT, and delivering a brutal punch. Gasps could be heard from bystanders, and a voice shouted, "Leave him alone. He's trying to help her." People across the city and soon across the country watched as the videos painted an ugly picture of an officer abusing his authority. Media outlets picked up the story, splashing headlines like "Officer Assaults EMT on Emergency Call" and "Ambulance Blocked Mother and Baby in Critical Condition." News anchors expressed outrage on air, their voices tinged with disbelief. Paul, monitoring the developments closely, felt both vindicated and sickened as he watched the outrage unfold. His phone rang constantly, reporters and community leaders calling to express solidarity, some even offering legal resources. Inside the district attorney's office, Paul sat across from Officers Daniels and Morales, the two officers who had stepped in to stop Charles that night. Both men looked tense but resolute, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. They'd already been briefed on the implications, and now they'd made the decision to testify, no matter the backlash. Daniels spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Mr. Everett, we want to make it clearer. Don't condone what Charles did. We've both worked with him. But he crossed a line that night. He put lives in danger, and he ignored every protocol we stand by." Paul nodded, his expression serious. "I appreciate you both coming forward. This isn't easy, but your testimony will be critical. Can you describe what you witnessed that night?" Morales took a breath, glancing at Daniels before speaking. "We arrived on the scene after getting a call about a disturbance involving an ambulance. When we got there, we saw Charles blocking the ambulance, berating the EMT and the husband. He was aggressive, more than we've ever seen. And when the husband tried to explain that his wife was in labor, Charles dismissed him and threatened them both." Daniels nodded. "We intervened because we knew it had gone too far. An ambulance should never be delayed during an emergency, and Charles refused to listen to reason. We had no choice but to step in. It was clear that he was out of control." Paul leaned forward, his voice steady. "Thank you. Your testimony will help ensure this man faces the consequences of his actions. You both did the right thing." As they left, Paul felt a renewed sense of determination. With these officers on his side, and the viral videos supporting their statements, he knew the case against Charles was ironclad. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as people filled the seats, eager to witness the start of the trial. Journalists with notepads poised, families with concerned expressions, and members of the public who'd followed the viral case on social media sat shoulder to shoulder. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice, and hashtags has spread to banners and placards. The impact of the incident was undeniable, and the community had rallied behind the victims. At the front, Officer Charles sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched. Dressed in a dark suit, he looked smaller without his uniform, stripped of the authority he'd once used to intimidate. His lawyer, a tall, polished man named Jeffries, whispered something to him. But Charles's eyes remained locked on the table in front of him, his expression inscrutable. Paul Everett sat behind the prosecutor's table, his gaze steely and focused. This wasn't just about his daughter and grandchild anymore. It was about setting a precedent. Next to him was Linda Cho, the lead prosecutor on the case, who was known for her relentless pursuit of justice. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and everyone stood as the judge took his seat. After formalities, the judge addressed the court. "We are here to consider the charges against Officer Robert Charles, which include assault, obstruction of medical services, and abuse of power. Officer Charles, how do you plead?" "Not guilty," Charles's lawyer Jeffries replied firmly. Linda's gaze didn't waver. She called her first witness to the stand, Louis, the EMT who had been assaulted by Charles. Louis walked up slowly, his face calm, but his eyes sharp, reflecting the strength that had carried him through that night. State your name and occupation, Linda prompted. Luis Marquez, EMT with County General, he replied, steadying himself. Mr. Marquez, Linda began, her voice clear and authoritative. Please describe what happened on the night of the incident in your own words. Louis took a breath. We were transporting a woman in active labor, and it was an emergency. She needed immediate medical attention at the hospital. On the way, Officer Charles stopped us, blocked the ambulance, and demanded paperwork. I tried to explain that we were on an urgent call, but he wouldn't listen. Linda nodded. And then what happened? He started to get aggressive. I told him again that this was a medical emergency, but he accused me of being disrespectful. The next thing I knew, he punched me, Louis said, his voice tight. He physically prevented me from doing my job. Gasps echoed through the courtroom, and Linda nodded, allowing the jury to absorb the weight of his words. Thank you, Mr. Marquez. No further questions. Next, Linda called Leo, the husband, who took the stand, his face filled with barely concealed anger. Mr. Hayes, can you describe your experience that night? Linda asked. Leo's gaze hardened. My wife was in the back of that ambulance, in labor and terrified. When I got out to try to reason with the officer, he shoved me around like I was nothing. I pleaded with him to let us go and told him about my wife and our unborn baby. But he didn't care. He paused, his voice cracking. I kept thinking, what if we don't make it in time? What if my wife or my baby dies because this man wouldn't let us pass? He didn't listen to a word I said. The jury looked visibly moved, and Linda gave a nod, signaling for the next witness. She called Officer Daniels, one of the officers who had intervened to restrain Charles that night. Officer Daniels, you were called to the scene that evening. What did you witness when you arrived? Linda asked. Daniels cleared his throat. We arrived to see Officer Charles physically blocking the ambulance and aggressively confronting both Mr. Marquez and Mr. Hayes. It was clear that he had escalated the situation beyond anything that could be considered protocol. When he refused to back down, we had no choice but to restrain him. Linda finished with a final question. Would you say Officer Charles's actions were appropriate? No, ma'am, Daniels replied firmly. They were reckless and abusive. There was no justification for his behavior. The jury exchanged glances, the weight of the testimony settling heavily over them. Linda's case was building, and the picture was becoming clear. Officer Charles had abused his power in a moment of unchecked aggression, endangering lives in the process. Jeffries, Charles's defense attorney, stood and adjusted his tie before calling his client to the stand. Charles walked up, his demeanor composed, though he avoided the jury's gaze. Officer Charles, Jeffries began, his voice smooth and reassuring. Can you tell us why you felt it necessary to stop the ambulance that night? Charles nodded, his voice even. The ambulance ran a red light, which is something I'm trained to look out for, even if it's an emergency vehicle. When I approached the EMT, he was confrontational. His behavior raised suspicion, and I felt that it was my duty to ensure nothing illegal was happening. Jeffries nodded sympathetically, as if affirming Charles's version of events. So you believe that the EMT's behavior warranted further investigation? Yes, Charles replied. I was following procedure to ensure public safety. The jury seemed skeptical, but Jeffries pressed on. And what about Mr. Hayes? Wasn't he interfering with your investigation? Charles nodded, his voice turning defensive. He was aggressive and disrespectful. I warned him to step back, but he kept coming at me, making threats. I did what I thought was necessary to control the situation. Linda rose for cross-examination, her tone firm. Officer Charles, are you aware that this was an ambulance on an emergency call? That the patient inside was in labor? Charles hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. Yes, but I believe they were being evasive. Linda's voice sharpened. Or perhaps you let your authority cloud your judgment. Isn't it true you escalated the situation unnecessarily? Charles didn't answer, his silence speaking louder than words. The tension in the courtroom thickened as the defense's argument crumbled under Linda's questioning. Linda stood for her closing arguments, taking a moment to look each juror in the eye. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the testimonies. You've seen the video evidence. Officer Charles had a responsibility to protect and serve. but instead he chose to endanger lives. He ignored protocol, assaulted an EMT, and obstructed a family in their moment of crisis. His actions went beyond a lapse in judgment. They were a deliberate abuse of power. She took a deep breath, letting the silence settle. This is not just about one night. It's about ensuring that those who wear the badge are held accountable when they cross the line. Sophie Hayes and her newborn were put at risk for no other reason than one man's refusal to put their safety above his ego. Linda stepped back, her gaze unwavering. Justice demands accountability. I ask you to find Officer Charles guilty on all counts. Jeffries rose for his closing argument, looking slightly rattled, but maintaining his composure. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Charles believed he was doing his job. Yes, his actions may seem severe, but he was acting on his instincts to ensure public safety. He did not intend to harm anyone. Please consider the difficulty of his position and the complexities of his duties. I urge you to see this as a misunderstanding, not a crime. As Jeffries took his seat, the tension in the room was palpable. The jury looked somber, aware of the weight of their decision. The judge instructed them to deliberate, and as they filed out, the courtroom was left in a charged silence, everyone waiting for justice to be served. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, each member's face solemn and resolute. Everyone in the room held their breath. Sophie's family, the witnesses, and even the media packed into the back rows. At the front, Officer Charles sat stone-faced, his gaze locked on the judge's bench as he awaited his fate. The judge turned to the jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with an expression of quiet determination. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, standing up and holding a sheet of paper. She cleared her throat, glancing down as she read. "In the case of the People vs. Officer Robert Charles, we find the defendant guilty on all accounts: assault, obstruction of medical services, reckless endangerment, and attempted destruction of evidence." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a collective exhale of relief. Leo squeezed Paul's shoulder, and Paul gave a small nod, his eyes hard with satisfaction. Justice, after all the months of anguish and fighting, had been served. The judge turned to Charles, his expression stern. "Officer Charles, you have been found guilty of serious charges that reflect an abuse of the authority entrusted to you. Your actions endangered the lives of a mother and her unborn child, compromised the integrity of law enforcement, and caused irreparable harm to public trust." Charles's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Charles sat motionless, his jaw clenched in resentment. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I hereby sentence you to 8 years in state prison, along with a fine of $100,000. Furthermore, you are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity for the rest of your life." A hush fell over the room, followed by a few gasps. 8 years. It was a harsh sentence, especially for a police officer, but no one in the room seemed inclined to protest. The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Court is adjourned." As the bailiff approached Charles to escort him away, he finally stood, his face etched with a mixture of bitterness and defeat. His eyes briefly met Paul's across the courtroom. Paul held his gaze, unflinching, until Charles looked away, resigned. A few weeks have passed since the incident. Sunlight streamed in through the window, casting a warm glow over Sophie as she lay propped up on her bed, looking tired but peaceful. In her arms, swaddled in a blue blanket, her newborn son slept soundly, his tiny fingers curled around her thumb. Leo sat by her side, his hand resting on her shoulder, as he looked down at their son with a mixture of awe and relief. After everything, after the nightmare of delays, the harrowing courtroom battles, and the long days in intensive care, they had made it. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "I can't believe he's here," she whispered, smiling softly. "And he's healthy. We're both okay." Leo leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We're more than okay," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You were so strong, Sophie. I don't know how you did it." She smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I had to. For him. For us." At that moment, The door opened quietly, and Paul stepped in, his face softening as he took in the sight of his daughter and grandson. He moved to her bedside, bending down to embrace her gently. "You scared us. You know that?" he murmured, though his voice was filled with warmth and relief. Sophie hugged him back, her voice choked with emotion. "I know, Dad. Thank you for everything you did." Paul pulled back, looking at her with pride. "I'd do it all over again," he said firmly. "For you. For him. We fought and we won. Now you can finally focus on healing, on being with your family." Leo placed his hand over Paul's, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You stood by us through all of it. We wouldn't have justice if it weren't for you." Paul nodded, glancing down at his grandson, who stirred in Sophie's arms. "This little guy deserves a world where he's safe," he said, his voice quiet. The family sat together in silence for a moment, each of them absorbing the weight of the journey they had endured. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and subscribe for more. Thanks for reading.